Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about KZ's new true wireless set called the VXS. So the case itself should look slightly familiar if you're a KZ fan. The SK10 actually had a very similar case, possibly the same case. And if we open it up, you'll also see that the shells themselves and the faceplate is very reminiscent of the KZ ZEX. The only difference being this is a opaque bottom shell as opposed to the ZEX, which actually was a clear or translucent style bottom of the shell. So a couple similarities to past sets. And right here, right next to me, is last year's my favorite KZ wireless set called the VX10. So this was actually a slightly different set. This one actually had 10 drivers, but that really meant there's 5 drivers per side. So that was dynamic driver and 4 BAs per side. But a very nice traditional KZ TWS set. And I used it most of last year. And, I think it's very traditional. VXS is more like KZ 2022. And if you've been watching my reviews on KZ sets, we talk about tuning a lot and how KZ is not the KZ of the past and how KZ has really been trying some new things tuning-wise. And the VXS is actually no different. And if we take sort of a look at what the graph looks like, you'll sort of see, so VX10 is, as I said, very traditional. It's very traditional V-shape. It's got, in blue, you see this sort of big bass hump. Lots of bass, lots of fun bass, nice energy for outdoor TWS listening. The mids are going to be slightly recessed because of that. And then you're going to get sort of a big rise in the treble and the upper mid area just to sort of balance out this amount of bass. And it's a very high energy, energetic, V-shaped, very fun, great for popular music. I think that is just a classic KZ style set. So when we look at VXS, you can kind of see the bass shelf is sort of slightly different. You sort of have this plateau through the sub bass right into the mid bass, and then the mid bass is sort of split between this little switchback looking shape. So lots of energy up here, and then it drops off very quickly right before it hits the mids. So a much cleaner mid style. You don't have this energy carrying through into the mids. This one drops down quite low. So you get not as recessed mids at all. And then you get a very, very gentle rise in the upper mids. So you don't have a lot of the shoutiness, big gain that you would get in the past on KZ sets. VXS is really, really kind of a smooth operator right there. And then they sort of put the presence and a detail right there in that little bump. And then it drops down again to keep the fatigue low. And then you get some upper treble energy there. So sort of looks not all that dissimilar from the VX10, but when you listen to it, it's a very, very different style. This is not a big high energy V-shaped style. It's a much more bassy, relaxed, very easygoing set compared to the VX10. So let's kind of jump into some of my notes. And like I was just saying, KZ, this VXS, I'll say KZ does relax, chill. This is probably maybe their best 1DD non-fatiguing set. KZ really did a pretty good job on the VXS. It really finds that balance of fun bass. Like I said, that bass shelf is actually quite high through the sub bass, giving you the right amount of detail, but still really remaining non-fatiguing, non-shouty. There's really no peaks in the treble that are really going to stand out on the VXS. It's very low rising gain area as well. It's kind of a very different style. If you've actually purchased some of the very older KZ sets, this is going to feel like something that was done by a totally different company. So in my opinion, this tuning, it definitely would probably make a better wired set in my opinion than an outdoor TWS set, just because it's a little more relaxed and a little more chill. I use TWS a lot in the summer, and I'm mainly outside doing yard work or I'm traveling. I'm in a more noisy environment, and having that bigger V-shape like the VX10 does, that actually works really well for me, and that's why I used VX10, and that's why I liked that set last year. This one in this kind of bassy, relaxed mode, perhaps that doesn't. I found myself just turning the volume up quite a bit just to kind of compensate for the outdoor noise. This one doesn't have noise cancellation. So I think, in my opinion, they probably should have made this one a wired set, the way it's tuned. For people who are going to use this outside, maybe that's not the perfect matching to what, at least in my use case. I think other people who do more quiet listening outside, it's probably going to be perfect for you guys. And I do think the driver is actually quite good, and it probably deserves a full wired treatment. So I will judge this one more as a IEM than a TWS, because the TWS features are sort of minimal. They really hit the mark on the ones that count, aptX and no background noise. I think those two things that aptX is something that has appeared on KZ sets and not appeared. Background noise says, again, it's been a sort of ongoing problem. KZ has kind of done some work on it, obviously. I think on this TWS set in particular is actually quite good. Touch control is kind of touchy. I think the area where you actually touch on these is maybe smaller than normal. I think most people try to touch on the big area, and I think this one is a little smaller. I haven't quite figured out where the 100% touch confirmation place is on that one, but I thought it was a bit touchy. And I do think KZ needs to sort of find their TWS niche, because on the wired side, they very much go after high value, delivering really good performance at lower cost. There's a lot of value in their wired sets. And on the TWS, they're sort of not falling behind, but they have to find this place where you can't necessarily stand out enough on just sound quality. You have to offer features that other TWSs at the same price range are offering, and you sort of lose the value proposition. If your only point is that you sound better, that doesn't really cut it anymore with TWS, with ANC and smart apps and modes and EQ, all these things that are starting to appear in TWSs at the same price point. I think KZ does need to either step up their game or go to higher quality materials, app support. There has to be another thing there to really give them that value proposition, because I'm not sure they're going to exist for too much longer just based on sound quality and a reasonable price. So the bass, like I said, this one is sort of that split shelf like we talked about. It's got plenty. This split shelf is in the red, so we got plenty of sub bass energy, and somewhere right around here in the mid bass it sort of drops off really quickly, and that gives you, I think, plenty of controlled bass is how I would call it, and you can actually get very minimal bleed into the mids because of that shape. It drops down really, really fast right before the mids, and I think for male vocals, sitting in that upper half of the mid bass, you do get the body that you should, and is not too thick, and I think that's where traditionally KZ would just kind of a more gentle slope, carrying in a little more energy into the mid bass, into the mids. You tend to get those thicker voices, and that's why I would always complain about KZ bass styles, because the lower male voices tend to be a little too thick, a little too unnatural. This one is better. And then for the lower bass and the sub bass, it actually, like I said, it just ratchets up very quickly to KZ fun levels. So if you are outside listening to some high energy popular music, it definitely hits those big bass levels, and you're not going to say this one is bass lean or bass light at all. It definitely goes there. It just doesn't carry it through right into the mids. So a track like Go Go Penguin, Signal and Noise, I think that last minute of that track, and you actually really, when you start to hear the big shelf part out here, I think it does get a little bit too heavy, and I would have brought it down a couple decibels, but as far as a KZ fun level of bass, I think it actually delivers quite well, and it's not super bloated. It's just heavy is what I would call that song. It just could have used a few less decibels, I think, right there. So the mids, like I said, with KZ and these recent 2022 sets, they've really been inspired by more expensive sets, whether that's Harman tune sets, whether that is more expensive hybrid sets. Their tunings have been more experimental, and I think the VXS is very much aligned with that. And this doesn't really come from KZ's past. This wasn't based on the VX10. It's definitely inspired by something new. And the mids, they're very kind of more natural, very relaxed, rather than high energy fun like the VX10 was. They're definitely balancing out this lower reduced bass style, and very much with the relaxed mids, upper mids as well. So really balancing out sort of these two pieces, saying, well, coming into the mids, we don't have a ton of extra mid bass energy. We don't have to burn through all of that heaviness with a whole lot of gain like you see VX10 did right there. So this level is very much reduced down there because this is lower here, and that it was a very good move for KZ to do. So like I said, upper mids don't require that big gain. We talked about that. Maybe too flat for outdoor TWS usage, like I was saying. So outdoors, if you're trying to listen in a more noisy environment, I do prefer like a little more of a V shape, a little more gain right there. I think that adds to separation and dynamics, especially at a lower volume. And but the way it is now in this very relaxed upper mid style, I think it does work, and I think it probably would actually work better as a wired set than a TWS, but this is what we have. So my main nitpick, that low 1 to 3K pin gain compensation. So this gap right here, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So this is probably a bit too low. This is pin gain compensation. So usually there's a big rise here, just the way VX10 does, and maybe VX10 goes a bit too high, whereas Harman sort of cuts right through the middle. I think the middle point would have been probably perfect on this set, and it would have given you just a little more energy right there in the female vocals. Those instruments that hit right there would just have a little more clarity and a little more detail, and I think it would have stood out a little more as a TWS set. So yeah, it's kind of a fascinating nitpick, and I think for other people, I think this low rise, no fatigue, no shoutiness, very, very smooth. That just works for certain people, certain music styles, and I 100% understand that. For me, I probably would have picked the Harman line, but that is me, and that's sort of my my main nitpick. And I think that just would have stood out a little better against those bassier tracks, like I said. So the treble, I think this targeted emphasis to keep the detail and no fatigue was kind of interesting as well. So like we talked about, upper mids quite low, and then it rises, so you get the presence, so you get detail. These instruments stand out right here, and that's 2.5 to about 4.5, and then it drops back down again, and then it kind of goes back up again. And I would call this sort of targeted detail or targeted emphasis on parts of the treble, as opposed to being a more consistent level like VX10 was. I think again that was sort of a experimental idea, and I'm sure they found that in some more expensive set and said that seems like a great idea and we'll give it a try. For me, I think it's just hard to maintain consistency. Some instruments are fine, some are low, but it's a decent balance, which is really keeping with the character of the set, because they didn't want to really raise the treble too high, because then it would be a little bit fatiguing and that would have ruined the whole character of the set. So just on a track like Another Chance Live from Above and Beyond, just balancing the darker parts of that track with the strings and the brighter parts of that instrument, it's just a little bit uneven for me. And I wouldn't even call it all that. It's just a nitpick is what I would call that one. It's just not used to what I was listening to. It's not like it's a horrible fault. I think it's just a little inconsistent in the treble area, but it works. So stage-wise, to me, it sounds a little taller than wide, and I think again this relaxed character of the set, where they added emphasis on certain frequencies and where they didn't, I think that sort of hinders a bigger stage compared to some previous KZ sets. And I think when that lower bass shelf really kicks in on certain tracks that are more bassy, it's just not as separated, and layering isn't as really nice as it should be, or even what you hear as when that bass shelf, when you're hearing kind of a more mid-bass, upper mid-bass, maybe less bass track, I think all that really works very, very well. But on those bassier tracks, I do think it's a little more congested than it can be, especially if you EQ the treble a little bit and make it a little more even. But generally, I would call this one definitely more than enough space for TWS usage, and I didn't really say it was all that compressed at all. I think it's a very nice amount of space for what it is, and especially for a TWS. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.